Houston, we have an imposter.
Hey there, welcome to another episode of the REDink Writers podcast. I'm Lydia Stevens, author of the Hellfire series and the Ginger Davenport escapades.
And I'm Sandy Butchers. I am the author and illustrator of the Singularian Grimoire anthologies on Patreon, and I'm currently in the Quarry Trenches with one of my full-length manuscripts. I'm super happy you could join us on another episode of the REDink Writers podcast. REDink is proud to be an official sponsor of WriteHive, the non-profit writing community providing free, inclusive events, programs, and resources for writers of all backgrounds. Now, if you're looking to join another online community, why don't you join the WriteHive community on Discord? We put the link below in the description.
Despite the title suggesting that this week's episode is sending something into space or that the 007 is going to gatecrash our party, this week's episode is all about mental health. More specifically, we're going to be talking about the dreaded imposter syndrome, the crusher of souls and dreams of every writer out there. Sandy and I are going to talk about the tips and tricks on how to recognize imposter syndrome and how to deal with it.
Absolutely. The imposter syndrome is known as the intelligent people curse, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later on. But before we get started, most people of you already know what imposter syndrome is, but for those who haven't, first of all, congratulations. I envy you. And second, Lydia, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what it actually is.
So imposter syndrome it's a feeling, actually. It's kind of this mental, state of mind that you get into where you're feeling not good enough, or you're looking at your peers and other writers in the industry, other authors, and you're thinking, why can't I have that? Why can't I be in that place that they're at, in terms of status or awards or bestsellers list or something, or book sales, even, how much book sales. So it really is a feeling, and it's not just one feeling, but like an amalgamation of feelings that makes you feel like you're not good enough to be a writer or an author. So that is basically what you feel like an imposter. You feel like you're not supposed to be doing this work or doing this job. So that's what imposter syndrome is.
Yeah, and just to make sure, this is not something that only happens to writers. I mean, it would be a very nice world if it only happened to writers, because then everyone else was sort of excluded from this feeling. But everybody suffers from imposter syndrome at some point in their life. So it's a very normal thing to do, which is also the reason why we discuss it right now, because for some reason there has been a little bit of a taboo on the subject. And I think, or at least I'm of the opinion, that the more we talk about these things to normalize it, it will also enable people to sort of, speak up on it and share their experiences so that we can all become better, from this.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think if we're going to share experiences, one of the biggest experiences that I have faced recently is the REDink Writers podcast. When we first started this podcast, we were all coming to it from different places in our writing careers, and and I remember thinking to myself, I was like, oh, what could I possibly bring the writing community? I don't have an agent yet. I'm not traditionally published. Why is anybody going to want to hear from me? What do I have to bring that would be anything of value? And then I got thinking, how do I turn that around? How can I kind of negate this imposter syndrome? Because, I did put the years into the schooling for the creative writing degree, for the bachelor's and the master's, and I did the interning, and I, for a literary agency and for a publishing press, and I've done over 5 years of developmental editing. So accumulatively, all of that experience is worth something. But when we only look at one piece or another, or we compare it to what somebody else has accomplished, that is imposter syndrome.
Yep.
And so I had to really sit and reflect and think, I can do this podcast. I have something of value to add to this. So that, that was probably one of the more recent, episodes that I have dealt with imposter syndrome.
Yeah. And do you have any idea what triggered this into you? Because I could totally imagine, as writers, I mean, we are constantly confronted with rejections. We query agents and they say, no, your work isn't good enough for me. And then they make it better by saying, well, it's specifically for me. It could be, the right thing for someone else, which of course is actually the case. But you still get that rejection. And I don't think there is a group of people that is confronted with this more often than writers. But I'm just thinking, like, the podcast is in a way disconnected from our experiences as writers or as editors or, whatever we did before we started the podcast. But still, it's connected to this feeling we have. So I'm just wondering, what's the trigger for you? What was it in there?
I think when we started looking at, and I know this is silly because it's a podcast, we want to get followers, we want to find people that we can reach. So similar to a writer wanting people to read my stories, I think it was that I'm going to put this out there for people to see. People, we're targeting people for an audience, and it was in that moment that I had that thought that I was like, how many other podcasts have come before me and they're hugely successful, and we're just starting out. Why is anybody going to want to look at a podcast from this just newly formed group, or I don't know what you call us, association, or however you want to call us. And I thought about it when we were talking about how to market and how to reach an audience and things like that. And I'm like, what gives me, it was that thought, what gives me the right to put this material out there? Mm-hmm. It was that thought that kind of triggered that. And I got thinking, I'm like, I've done this and I've done that, and but does it all count to be able to say I am good enough to be able to do this? That it was that moment of what gives me that right. And I think that feeling, even when you take it away from just writing or podcasting or editing or something like that, that's a fundamental human emotion of self-worth. So what makes us feel good enough to be able to do something, or like we're worthy enough? And I think we're going to touch on this a little bit today. And I was thinking about it the other day because of a discussion that you and I had, and it's pride. There's a huge difference between being egotistical and being too proud. And I have seen that. And I'll touch on that in the intern insights a little bit, where people kind of go too far on the spectrum of pride, and then they just kind of come out looking like a jackass. But being able to take pride in our work and the things that we've accomplished, that's a huge part of this feeling of we're brought up to believe, be humble, and don't boast. So then that imposter syndrome creeps up when we have something that we want to show the world, and we want to say, hey, I did this, or hey, I contributed to this. So it's a little sense of pride. I think that it's finding that balance between, it's okay to express that you've accomplished something, and then it goes too far, or it's not enough. You don't have enough self-worth or enough pride in your work and that's where the imposter comes in, and they're like, good enough.
And I also think there are a lot of more things that come in right on that spot, because you also mentioned the cultural thing. Like, we grow up in a society that sort of forces you to be humble about your work. Then again, you and I come from different sides of the world. So I'm from Europe, and here in Europe, it's pretty normal to say, like, I'm proud of what I've done. Mm-hmm. But the moment someone gives you a compliment on your work, that's where you go humble and go, oh, no, it wasn't really that much, it's nothing. And so there are many cultural differences. I mean, I could totally understand that someone from Asia is maybe even more humble in the way they talk about their own work than, you as an American are, because Americans are also known to be, in a way, to be humble about what they do. It's like, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's like black and white in there. They are completely boasting, like, oh, we did this and we are so good. Or there's the other side going, nah, it's,
I think, well, I mean, if you even take kind of the sentiment, proud to be an American. I mean, I think, I had this discussion with several friends who are not from America, and they say one of the things that they notice is, and this is, not to sort of straying too far off topic, but Americans really take pride in the fact that they are American, and so it's that, you know, the flags and the parade and the fireworks, and yet so yes, you have two sides of that. Either you have people who, you know, yeah, it's you know, it's my work, here it is, but you know, and then you have people and they're like, yeah,
look at it. Exactly.
Yeah, so you do have, and to be fair, I think you could probably find that in any country, but
Oh, yeah.
because Americans are known to be sort of so larger than life is the best way I can.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. It is,
you know,
yeah.
It's, you know, I think that bringing us back around to the writing community, you also have different writing styles from different countries. You've got very different voices coming from different countries. So we may come across on the page as well as being very sort of in your face, or in like a query letter or something like that. And I can't attest to everybody. You know, I've only, and here it is again, I have only interned for a year with a literary agency. So that's, you know, that sense of I'm proud that I did the work, but sort of, you know, cut it back a little, be a little bit humble. So yes, there's that little bit of imposter saying, you know, try not to boast about it. So yeah, I think you're going to have that different mentality no matter where you go. And that's just where, you know, you can separate that from just the writing community as well. And just say that's human nature, that's mental health, that's being self-aware of who you are, what you've accomplished, and having the ability to express it. And I think not all writers are, but many writers are introverts. So when you add that to the mix, you know.
And I also did, I mean, I've been reading a lot on this subject, and if you look at the actual psychological studies, there are also a lot of markers that go all the way back to your childhood. Like it depends, or your susceptibility to imposter syndrome is also connected to how you grew up as a child. So if as a child you were often reminded that, you know, what you did, it was great, it was perfect, but look at him, look at her, and you were continuously compared to someone else, as an adult you are much more susceptible to the imposter syndrome than, you know, if you were always the good kid, if you always did everything right and everybody was always praising you. And you know, and I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I mean, there are so many ways of growing up, but I do think that if everyone who thinks for themselves, like I definitely have imposter syndrome, and they go back to their childhood, either one of these things is going to pop up. You either were the best of the class, or you were continuously compared to the others, and then it's just something you can do for yourself. You know, compare these things together.
I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit here. So you've got, you know, the kid who does everything perfectly, the good grades. I was that kid. I got, you know, here I am bragging a little bit, and I don't want to. But when you get into it, and that's, I think, with any child, when you get into that is your normal, people expect that from you.
Exactly.
Then it's not something to be praised. It's, you know, they know that you're going to do the work. They know that it's going to be a grade A. You know, you're going to get the good grade, or however it's scored wherever you are.
There is an expectation of you to continuously have top notch.
Yeah. So it's no longer just the kid who's being compared to the kids who are doing everything right. It's the kid who's, you know, who has the really good grades, and they're being overlooked.
Yeah.
And that's getting into education and the system and stuff like that. But you're right, it does come from childhood, but you've got, you know, all of those kids who, in one way or another, this affects them, and how we treat our kids, and how we look at how they're learning, and what sort of reinforcement we're giving them, either positive or negative. So, yeah, I definitely agree with you about it stems from childhood and how you're brought up. But, you know, to be all-encompassing, you know, any child can be affected by imposter syndrome. It depends on how we approach it.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to say, and maybe it didn't come out right. So sorry if that happened. But
No,
yeah,
no,
there are.
Imposter, you said it right.
Yes, okay. And yeah, it's a coin with many sides. It's not just a coin you flip it, you either have it or you don't. It's a coin that just it's random. You have it or you don't, or maybe you have it right now and you don't have it tomorrow. There is no rule in how people go through imposter syndrome. Like, it's different for everyone, although there are certain things that you can recognize in yourself that may help you find out different triggers, or maybe alert yourself on, hey, that's something that could definitely trigger me into an imposter syndrome. So if you know from yourself, I am suffering from this a lot, like I run into this continuously, those are things to look into, like what triggers me. And you can go back to your childhood, you can go back to your adolescence, or when you're an adult, it doesn't matter, but try to find these points in life where you can pinpoint where it comes from.
Yeah, I mean, life affects our mentality, and therefore it affects our writing. I've been sitting and writing, and then in a critique session, you've even said it to me before. You're like, you were not in a good headspace this week, and it shows. This whole scene needs to be, you need to bring this particular character's voice, her snark, her sarcasm, her back into the scene, because it's just not there.
Yeah.
So, I think one of the big things with imposter syndrome is recognizing that life makes us have all of these feelings that makes us feel like an imposter, and therefore it affects the writing. So, as far as triggers, recognizing, am I in I know I want to sit and I want to get some words on the page, but maybe when I'm in a better mood, I got that rejection letter from an agent, and I'm still trying to sit here and I'm still trying to get the words onto the page, but I know mentally that it's affecting the words on the page. So, maybe I need to go back, the next day and take a look at what I did write and revise accordingly, depending on, the tone that you've got out, or the words or the dialogue. Sometimes we even, without realizing it, emulate the conversations that we have in life, and they end up on the page. So I think it's recognizing those triggers of what is affecting me on the outside that is affecting me internally on the computer and on the inside.
Yeah. And there's also many things you can do to sort of cure it, because imposter syndrome is definitely curable. And in fact, if you want to have some tips and tricks on how to deal with it, I posted a mini episode earlier this week on YouTube. So I'll put a little marker on top of the screen. I always forget which corner it is, but you can click that and look that back. So you can take your time and watch these tips as you go. REDink has opened the doors to their virtual studio for fellow writers. Do you want your book promoted on our show, or would you seize a chance to be interviewed by us on your work? Well, that is now possible. On our brand new website, REDinkWriters.com, you can enter the raffle to win the book promotion or the interview. So what are you waiting for? This week, we'd like to show you Covenant, a book by M.W. MacLeod. It tells you the story of Illyria, whose father passed away and whose mother fell into a drug habit shortly after. Desperate for any help she could get, Illyria researches a magical spell on the internet. Casting it hastily and under imperfect conditions, she now finds herself accidentally bound to a demon called Zangrunath. The two are stuck together, and now Illyria must navigate the last few months of high school, budding relationships, and college applications, all while Zangrunath harbors a very dark secret. Now, if that doesn't sound like an exciting read to you, I don't know what is. So do get your hands on this book, and we put the link below in the descriptions, or you can go to beyondtheveilauthor.com.
Hey everyone, it's Lydia again, and I am bringing to you the #Intern Insights. And this is just based off my experience interning for a literary agency and a publisher. And today I'm going to be talking to you about two different things, and they're a little bit connected, so just bear with me a little bit. So the first one that I want to talk about is how to find the right agent. And if you had been watching our personal Twitter handles, we did post some videos earlier this week, and in the first one it was this very topic. And one of the things that I talk about is tools to help you find a literary agency. I personally love Query Tracker because this helps me keep track of when I queried an agent, when I got a rejection, how long the query has been out. If I don't receive a response, but I know that an agent will typically respond after so many months, I can kind of, figure out that maybe it's time to move on and query somebody else. So one of the things that you want to focus on when you're looking for your agent is not just whether or not they represent your genre. And I did say this in the video before, however, I cannot stress this enough. You may have a fantasy novel with romance, and you may be looking for fantasy agents. Not all fantasy agents want a fantasy romance novel, okay? This is a big thing that I'm seeing in the community, actually within the last few weeks. One in a writers group that I'm involved with, and it's specifically a fantasy group, and then the questions have been posed again and again, how people feel about fantasy with romance. Well, an agent has a preference as well. And they may state very specifically and explicitly on their website, they will represent fantasy, they do not want it to have romance. It's a good bet if your book has romance in it and it's a fantasy, don't query that agent. And you could even try to manipulate your query letter in the sense that you direct it towards them and say it's just fantasy.
We're being interrupted by the cat, by the way. I'm sorry, it's okay, we can just go on, but just so you know, she's on here.
Okay, I don't care. Okay, so if your book has romance in it, don't query that agent that only wants fantasy with no romance, because they're going to figure it out, either through your query letter, your synopsis, or the actual book itself, and then you've wasted their time and they're going to reject you. So when you're looking at something like a tool like Query Tracker, it will give you a link to their website, sometimes their Twitter, sometimes their manuscript wish list, sometimes their AAR profile. Take a look at those. Do a Google search on the agent. See if they've done any interviews. I do this all the time, and sometimes the interviews are old. If they're over a decade old, you might want to maybe look at something a little bit more recent to see what their interests are, because they change. So when you're trying to find an agent, you really need to research the agent extensively. Not just take a look at, oh, they rep fantasy, sci-fi, and horror. There a lot of times will be more specific. I know manuscript wishlist is a great tool for authors to use to find an agent, because they fill out an entire profile of.
So first we have the cat, now we have the dog. Today is just one of those days.
Yeah.
Let's just roll. Roll with it.
Okay. So really do your research on your agent, because they don't want to be queried something that they're not going to represent, because then it just puts them in an awkward position. And writing rejection letters is awkward. Even those form letters, sometimes the form letter just doesn't cut it. So when there's a query that comes in and it just sits you with your jaw hanging open, and you're like, I don't know how to respond to this. Agents are people too, and they are still looking for human ways to interact with you. Yeah, I'm human. It's true though. Agents have feelings, they have preferences. So you really need to try to get to know the agent before you query them. And that way, when you query them, you can do so with confidence and think, this could really potentially be an agent that I'm going to work with. Another useful thing from those interviews, even if it is a decade old, an interview will give you a little bit of a personality of an agent. So that's going to help you get to know them before you query them. Even if it's just a smidge, just a little bit. Their social media, you can find out what their likes and their interests are, what they dislike. And that way you can kind of get a sense of, would I even get along with this person? Because working with an agent is still a working relationship that you have to develop. So I can't stress enough how to find an agent. Do your research on the agent. See what they like, what they dislike, what they represent. What they don't represent is just as important. Don't query an agent who says they don't want sci-fi and say, well, I have a sci-fi, but it could kind of be a fantasy. If you look at it like this, don't do that if it is a sci-fi. I've seen this happen, and it's really aggravating, and it's a waste of time, okay? Really know who the agent is before you send that query letter. So this leads a little bit into imposter syndrome that I was talking about this week as well, because it's that feeling of self-worth. It's that, am I good enough to get an agent? You know, what do I have to do? Who do I have to be? What do I have to aspire to be able to get an agent? And it's that, I'm not good enough. It's never going to happen. I just get rejection letters. So it really kind of brings you down. And with every rejection that comes in, you start feeling like, oh, I just can't do this. I'm not good enough. The writing is not good enough. That's not necessarily the case. It could be a matter of that agent just isn't right for you. That agent is not representing currently what you are querying to them, which is frustrating, I know, but based on their interests, they may represent nonfiction, memoirs, DIY, the whole spectrum, women's fiction. They could represent horror, fantasy, sci-fi, but they're just not in the mood for horror. So it's frustrating, yes, but you also have to consider that agents probably have a little bit of imposter syndrome too. The agent needs to be good enough to represent your work to the publisher. Okay, so if you can think about it like that, you can maybe connect with them on a more even playing field. Yes, you want to get an agent. That doesn't put them necessarily up on a pedestal. It's just finding the person that you can both come to this working relationship with that sense of self-worth, and that you are really bringing out the best in each other and the best in the work. So imposter syndrome is one of those tricky little buggers, because it can also negatively affect how we go about the querying process. And I've experienced this myself. You know, I'm querying a project that I'm really into and I'm really excited about it, and I just keep getting rejection letter. Depending on what's going on in my life, I might get those rejection letters. I'm like, all right, on to the next one.
Yeah,
if it's a form letter. And I might have a really bad day and get a rejection letter and think, oh, why does the universe hate me so much? Like, why can't I just get this agent to accept my work? And it's, life affects how we come into this process, and how we feel about ourselves, and how we go about the writing and the querying. So you really need to be aware of yourself. And talking about mental health, this is such a big thing in the news lately. This applies to writers too. You know, we see a lot in the news about athletes, especially with the Olympics right now, and mental health and what it means to them. You need to be aware of your own mental health to be able to really be successful in this industry. So when you're coming to an agent and you want to find an agent, you know, you need to kind of have a plan in place for how you're going to deal with when the imposter syndrome hits, and what you're going to do when the rejections come in, and how you're going to cope with that, and are you going to let it affect your writing, or are you going to maybe take a break? Are you going to send out a query letter the very next day in anger because you just want that agent? You know, think about that. Is that going to come across to that new agent the way that you want it to? So how to find an agent compared to imposter syndrome. They are connected. Okay, so you need to be very aware, I cannot stress this enough, of yourself and your process and your goals and your dreams, and remember that they are yours and that you are in control of them. And if you take that and you go forward into this process, eventually, depending on how the market is going, the agent's preferences, if you've done your research and you're finding the agent, you are going to be successful, and you are going to find the agent, you're going to find that book publishing deal. And the imposter syndrome, guess what? It's still going to creep up on you. I have some friends who are bestsellers. They have the sales, they have the followers, they have the, and they still, oh, thanks you guys. I can't, you know, it happens to everybody. So just be aware that sometimes I think those of us who haven't found the agent or the book publishing deal yet or something like that, we can never speak for somebody else, but it almost feels like, oh, it just hits us so much harder. It doesn't. It hits everybody, because it's not just about writing, it's about people. It's about the person inside. So you really need to embrace that person and say, you know what, I am worth it. I can do this. Maybe the writing isn't the best right now, and that's why I'm not getting a deal, but I can improve that. I can improve me. Writing is about improving oneself. not just the story. So remember that when you're going to deal with that little imposter.
This week's Twitter poll, we asked you what you were most eager to hear about. We gave you 3 options. We asked you if you wanted to hear about recognizing triggers for imposter syndrome. We asked you if you wanted us to talk about imposter syndrome versus jealousy. Or the last option was, and I'm going to have to peek at my screen right now, inverted positives. And there was an obvious winner. It was imposter syndrome versus jealousy. So Lydia, can you maybe talk us a little bit on how to sort of define the difference between, or how they are related to each other?
The little green man of envy, jealousy affects everyone. Yeah.
It's there.
At its core, imposter syndrome is jealousy. Like I said before, imposter syndrome is a feeling, it's an emotion, a mental state of mind of not feeling good enough. And where does that come from? That comes from comparing ourselves to what others have done. So you do have a sense of jealousy in there. You might not be thinking about it consciously. It may be subconscious, where you're thinking, I don't have this agent, somebody else has this agent, or I don't have this publishing deal, somebody else does, or how come I can't sell 500 books in 10 minutes like so and so. So we don't quite realize we're doing it, but it does stem from comparison of what others have done before us, what others are doing now, where we are now, what we have done in the past that has not added up to what others have done in the past. So yeah, imposter syndrome, it's that that recognition of, or not necessarily recognition, but it's that feeling of our self-awareness, our self-worth, and comparatively to jealousy, where we're actively thinking about other people and not internalizing it. So I think the difference is with imposter syndrome, it's internalized. With jealousy, it's externalized. But both are connected because both are a feeling of a sense of self. So now we're getting into a little bit of Freud here with the id, the ego, and the superego. But if we're gonna psychoanalyze ourselves,
I'm not sure we should do that.
Yeah, it really is that there is a correlation between the two, and there is also, the difference, which is internal versus external.
Yeah, because I was already thinking, and it's good that you say the internal external part. It's good that there is an emphasis on that, because if I think, am I jealous? I don't experience my imposter syndrome as me being jealous of someone else, but I do know there are moments where I'm really jealous. For example, when I read something, or I read a part of the manuscript someone has been querying, and I have a very strong opinion about that, and I compare it and I think my work is better. It happens sometimes. And then that person lands an agent and I'm like, what? How? Tell me how. Explain this to me. How? And I cannot grasp the fact that that person is at that point successful. And I do acknowledge and I do recognize that is where I'm jealous. Mm-hmm. But on all the other levels where I, have imposter syndrome, but I don't feel that jealousy necessarily. So yeah, there is a very big difference between, or are there different kinds of jealousy then maybe? Because I don't know.
I think that essentially we hear the term jealousy and we immediately think of it as a bad thing. It's a negative. Mm-hmm. There are healthy forms of jealousy, and that is, I think, when you start to get into a little bit of competition. And that can be good for a writer. So let's take you and I, for example, and Twitter and follow.
Oh, yeah.
and it's, I'm only 100 away from you, or we're pretty close neck and neck to how many followers we have on Twitter, and we talk about that. And so there's that little bit of competition. It's not a bad thing, because it keeps us motivated to keep coming back to the community and interacting and saying, hey, here's this thing, community, like and follow, I'll retweet, or hey, here's our episode for why don't you give it a look, or something like that. And so we're building the network, which is essentially what we want. So we don't then take the jealousy to the next level, which is I think where you start to get into that negative feeling towards the term jealousy, of maliciousness. So there, yes, there are different levels of jealousy. And like I said, with imposter syndrome, I think it's a jealousy that we're not aware of because we're not actively thinking about it.
Yeah.
We're comparing to other people, other books, other success stories or something like that. But we're focused more on our own work, of why our work is not good enough and is not comparable to those other successes or those other stories. So that's where I think, we get into how they're related, but more how they're different, because I stand by the one is internal, one is external. Jealousy is very external kind of a feeling. And so we have to consider that jealousy is not a bad thing as long as it does not become malicious, because it's still a feeling. And human emotion is not wrong. It's what we do with it. It's the action that we do with it that then becomes, I guess, negative or frowned upon or something like that. So external jealousy, acting out against somebody because we're jealous of them, that is wrong. Likewise, internal jealousy, beating ourselves up. I can't do this. I'm not good enough. I'm never going to be good enough. The book's never going to publish. You are sitting there and you are literally punching yourself over and over and over internally and bruising yourself and hurting yourself mentally, emotionally. And that eventually affects physically as well. Yeah. So that is just as wrong, I guess you could call it. So emotions are never wrong, and people is what we do with them.
Exactly. And I think if you are looking for a key on how to work with emotions, I think that being aware of them and being aware of what you feel and what you're going through is the most important part of working with them. Because if you are aware of the fact that you're internalizing it, or if you're aware of the exact opposite, that's the moment where you can start acting on it. You can start making the decisions. Because the interesting part is, if we let this go, our emotions are capable of wiping out all the successes we have, gone through in our lives. We can hit one negative and it can wipe out everything that we have done. And at that point, and when that happens, we are allowing that to happen. And sometimes it's just simply because we need a moment of wallowing in self-pity, and those moments are fine as well. It's fine to wallow, but it's better to crawl out of that again. In fact, it's necessary to crawl out of that again, because if we don't, that's when we allow this emotion to delete everything else. And I think, and I already mentioned it in one of my shorter episodes earlier this week, the most important part to conquer your imposter syndrome is to remember the stuff that you have done before the imposter syndrome hit you. So if my imposter syndrome is triggered by a rejection letter from a literary agent, I am going back to everything I've done before that rejection. I have finished a couple of manuscripts. How many people have done that? Of course, there is the online community of thousands of people who have done that, which, is also a tricky one to play with, because, there's thousands of people, but you are one of thousands on how many billion people on this earth? Right. So that's an accomplishment. You have maybe even, you might have done a podcast. You may have some art lying around the world. You may excel at the job you do. There are so many things you have done in your life that are successful, and it's important to be aware of that in order to stop that emotion from taking a walk with you.
Right, I completely agree, and I think that kind of brings in the term that we talked about a little bit of inverted positives.
Yes.
And I think with imposter syndrome, one of the ways to describe it is we don't feel like we're contributing, because it can't be real. What we're doing can't be real, therefore we are an imposter. And there is nothing not real about contributing to the arts, to the writing community, to culture, to whatever form you are presenting yourself, whether it be art, writing, music, anything like that, is essentially a contribution to humanity. And I think that we don't quite consider that when we're beating ourselves up, that we're still contributing to the world of 8 billion people. And we're saying, this is what I have to give to you, world. And so I think what happens a lot is because there are 8 billion people, we get that feeling of not necessarily notoriety, but relevance. Are we relevant to those 8 billion?
Yeah, we feel insignificant maybe in a way. Yeah.
And how can we, maybe at the end of the day, at the end of life, you look back and you reflect and you think, what did I contribute? And is anybody going to remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just the fact that your imprint, you're here and you're leaving a trail behind for, whether it affects one person or whether it affects 5,000 people, that is very important. So when the imposter syndrome is creeping up and you're looking at the inverted positives, and you're taking that, what can I contribute? Then you take that and you invert that and put it as a positive, and you say, you know what, this is what I can contribute. Mm-hmm. This is my thing to bring to the world, and really use that to motivate. I mean, take a look at our slogan, I've got this, but I don't know what the fuck I'm doing.
Yeah.
How does that not just absolutely scream to, here's how you can battle imposter syndrome? Mm-hmm. I mean, we come at this podcast, we come at our writing, we come at our editing, the graphic design and stuff like that. Sometimes we have no idea what we're doing, and
and we're just rolling with it.
But it's that attitude of, I've got this. That first part, I've got this. Mm-hmm. So I think that is so important to remember when we're trying to turn those negative feelings, those negative thoughts into a positive.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well said. Well, that's it again for today. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please leave a like and do subscribe. Because, if you subscribe and hit that bell button, you will never miss another episode from the REDink Writers podcast again. Next week, we have another Twitter poll for you. And we will be talking about crutch words and how to drop them. Or actually, how to get rid of them. So thanks again for watching. Do subscribe, and we will be seeing you again on the next episode. Bye.
Sandy forgot to tell you, you've got this, even if you don't know what the fuck you're doing.